Hello viewers, welcome to Newsweek South Asia, a show where we will provide you fresh insights into South Asia's geopolitical, strategic and security situation. Let's take a look at the headlines first. The Baloch leader raised alarm over Pakistan's crackdown at UNHRC. India demands global action against terror, warns against double standards at UNGA. And terror hits Karachi, Pakistan launches cross-border strikes into Afghanistan. Balochistan is once again at the center of international attention. Allegations of enforced disappearances, military crackdowns, and shrinking democratic space have resurfaced after the reported life imprisonment of prominent Baloch rights activist Dr. Maharang Baloch. On the sidelines of the 62nd session of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, Baloch Voice Association President Munir Mengal accused Pakistan of weaponizing its judiciary and security apparatus to silence dissent. But beyond one activist's conviction lies a larger story, one of a province where rights groups say repression has been institutionalized. A report.
For decades, Balochistan has remained Pakistan's most volatile province, rich in natural resources, strategically crucial because of Gwadar Port and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, yet repeatedly accused of being governed through military control rather than civilian consensus. The latest flashpoint is the reported life imprisonment of Baloch activist Dr. Maharang Baloch, a move that has triggered outrage among Baloch groups and renewed scrutiny of Pakistan's human rights record. Activists argue that the verdict is not an isolated legal decision but part of a broader campaign targeting students, journalists, doctors, lawyers, and civil society voices demanding accountability. Over the past year, Balochistan has witnessed repeated demonstrations led not by armed groups but by women, students and families searching for missing relatives. The Baloch Yakjehti Committee, headed by Dr. Maharang Baloch, became one of the most visible civil rights platforms highlighting enforced disappearances and custodial abuses. It was against this backdrop that on the sidelines of the 62nd session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Baloch Voice Association President Munir Mengal accused Pakistan of intensifying its military crackdown in the province.
The situation in Balochistan is getting worse day by day. And this was earlier anticipated, the way Pakistan treated, the Baloch people since, after the elimination of Nawab Akbar Khan Bukti. And this was what we were expecting, that Pakistan will use more force, and they used more force to dominate the region, to dominate the people. Unfortunately, the resistance has gone more, the Pakistani forces got more resistance by the people in all walks of life. The Baloch women, they stood up, the Baloch students, the political parties, and the Baloch civil society representatives, professors, doctors, people from all walks of life, they resisted the Pakistani way, how they were treating the Baloch people.
Mengal alleges that Islamabad's strategy of suppressing political dissent has instead fueled greater resistance across Baloch society. He says today's movement extends beyond politics, drawing participation from women, academics, lawyers, and ordinary citizens, challenging what activists describe as the growing dominance of Pakistan's military establishment over civilian life in the province. Mengal also questioned the independence of Pakistan's judicial process, arguing that the verdict against Dr. Maharang Baloch reflected political direction rather than judicial autonomy. He warned that the conviction would not silence the movement but instead amplify international attention.
Dr. Maharang Baloch is not an individual. She's a representative of the Baloch people, and she has raised the voice of the Baloch people throughout the globe, not only in Balochistan or in Pakistan, but she has been awarded by Norwegian organizations. So the way Pakistani courts, took her to this stage that they've given her a life imprisonment sentence. This was, by her. These were her own words in the court, that you, Mr. Justice, you do not have any authority to give me any sort of justice. You will only read those messages and give me that decision which the authorities will write and send to you. And this is what really this had happened.
Human rights advocates have long argued that independent scrutiny of Balochistan remains limited. International organizations, including human rights groups, have reported difficulties in accessing the province, while journalists have frequently described restrictions on reporting from conflicted areas. Mengal urged the United Nations to move beyond statements and establish an independent mechanism to investigate allegations emerging from the region.
Pakistan's handling of the unrest in Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir is now drawing global attention. Weeks after the crackdown on the Joint Awami Action Committee's mass movement in Rawalakot, rights activists have taken the issue to the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. Alleging killings, mass arrests and communication restrictions and a humanitarian blockade, they accused Islamabad of turning a political movement for basic rights into a security operation, demanding an independent international investigation into what they describe as systematic repression in POJK. A report.
What began as a public movement demanding affordable electricity, subsidized wheat, constitutional safeguards and greater political representation in Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir has snowballed into one of the region's biggest political confrontations in recent years. Following the June 7 violence in Rawalakot, rights groups allege Pakistani security forces launched an extensive crackdown, opening fire on demonstrators, arresting hundreds of activists, filing anti-terrorism cases against leaders of the Joint Awami Action Committee, and imposing restrictions that disrupted daily life across parts of POJK. Activists say a movement centered on basic civil rights has instead been met with coercion and intimidation. Seeking global attention for the issue, members of the United Kashmir People's National Party staged a demonstration outside the United Nations Human Rights Council during its 62nd session in Geneva, urging the international community to investigate what they described as systematic human rights violations in Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir.
It is also unfortunate that Pakistani security forces has controlled, occupied hospitals and stop essential commodities, food, drinks, water, and also milk and medicine for children and elderly people and the patients who are in the entire region of so-called Azad Jammu and Kashmir. So the protesters are chanting to end this siege, to end this occupation, and they are demanding rights and freedom from Pakistan.
Against this backdrop, members of the United Kashmir People's National Party carried the issue to the United Nations Human Rights Council during its 62nd session in Geneva. Campaigners accused Pakistan of imposing a virtual lockdown across parts of POJK. They alleged that roads remained blocked, movement is heavily restricted, and entire communities are struggling to access food, medicines, and healthcare. Speakers argued that Islamabad has responded to political dissent not through dialogue but through coercion, using arrests, intimidation, and sweeping legal action to silence critics while preventing independent scrutiny of the region. They urged the UNHRC to send an international fact-finding mission and investigate the alleged abuses.
रियासत को चाहिए कि मुज़ाकरात से बात करे और कश्मीरियों के जो जायज़ मुतालबात हैं उनको माने और कश्मीरियों के जो हकूक़ की बात है उसको एक्सेप्ट करे। इस वक्त हमारी सिचुएशन है कि हमारे जो बाहर के रास्ते हैं, हमारी जो, क्योंकि हमारा सारा दारोमदार तो पाकिस्तान के रास्तों से आता है, फूड का भी, मेडिसिन का भी, हर किस्म की जो हमारी बातें हैं, तो वो जो है वो रोके गए हैं, रास्ते ब्लॉक किए हुए हैं पुलिस ने, रेंजर्स ने, और वो उन गाड़ियों को, उनकी जो तरसील है उसमें रुकावट बन गए हैं। और अब मुझे ख़तरा है कि ये कहीं हंगामे, जो कहत की हंगामी सूरत हाल बपा हो जाएगी कश्मीर में। कश्मीर का, मेरे अपनी वालदा के साथ 15-20 दिन हो गए कोई रब्ता नहीं है। उनकी वो बीमार हैं, 90 ईयर्स की हैं, और मैं समझता हूँ कि उनकी दवाइयाँ हर वीक में लेनी होती हैं। ये बहुत जुल्म है, ये जुल्म है। इसको मैं ये नहीं सोचता कि ये सियासत है, ये जुल्म है।
Rights defenders told the UNHRC that the developments in POJK reflect a broader pattern of shrinking democratic space under Pakistan's security establishment. According to activists, journalists documenting the protests, political workers supporting the JAAC movement, and human rights defenders have increasingly come under pressure. They alleged enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, and a growing media blackout, making independent reporting from POJK increasingly difficult. Speakers warned that unless international institutions intervene, the situation could deteriorate further, with ordinary civilians continuing to bear the brunt of the crackdown.
At the United Nations General Assembly, India has delivered one of its strongest global messages against terrorism, declaring that there can never be any justification for terror, regardless of ideology, politics, or strategic interests. Calling on the international community to reject double standards, India urged nations to stop distinguishing between good and bad terrorists, strengthen action against terror financing, and deny safe havens to those who nurture terrorist networks. The statement comes at a time when the global terror ecosystem is rapidly evolving from cross-border proxy networks to cryptocurrency, crowdfunding, and AI-enabled radicalization. Our report.
For a country that has lived through decades of cross-border terrorism, India's message at the United Nations was not merely diplomatic, it was shaped by experience.
India called for adoption of the comprehensive.
From the attacks in Mumbai and Parliament to repeated strikes on civilians, soldiers and pilgrims in Jammu and Kashmir, India has long argued that terrorism cannot be compartmentalized or selectively condemned. Addressing the UN General Assembly during the adoption of the 9th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, India's permanent representative ambassador Parvathaneni Harish reminded the world that terrorism remains the gravest assault on humanity's most basic right, the right to life. And he made India's position unmistakably clear.
India has been a victim of cross-border terrorism for decades. Our people have paid a terrible price, and this experience has shaped India's zero-tolerance approach. Irrespective of any grievance, political cause, or strategic calculation, terrorism in all its forms and manifestations must be condemned unequivocally.
The timing of India's intervention is significant. 20 years after the United Nations adopted its global counter-terrorism strategy, New Delhi says the world still lacks a university-accepted legal definition of terrorism. India has once again pushed for the long-pending Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, or CCIT, a proposal first introduced by New Delhi in 1996. Successive delays, India argues, have allowed legal loopholes to persist, enabling terrorists, financiers and their sponsors to exploit safe havens while political disagreements stall collective action. India's concerns extend beyond bombs and bullets. The battlefield has shifted online. The Financial Action Task Force has warned that terrorist organizations are increasingly exploiting social media, encrypted messaging platforms, cryptocurrencies, and fraudulent crowdfunding campaigns to raise and move funds across borders. Against that backdrop, India urged countries to strengthen financial intelligence sharing, fully implement FATF standards, and ensure that no jurisdiction becomes a conduit for terror financing. Without naming any country, New Delhi also observed that attempts to undermine FATF's credibility often reflect a fear of scrutiny rather than genuine procedural concerns, a remark widely viewed as an indirect response to Pakistan's repeated criticism of the watchdog. India also questioned the selective approach that often clouds international counter-terrorism efforts. It argued that sanctions must be objective, evidence-based and free from geopolitical calculations. For New Delhi, defeating terrorism requires political will, not political convenience. The message carried an unmistakable subtext. Countries that continue to differentiate between useful and unacceptable terrorist groups or allow terrorist infrastructure to survive within their territory while speaking the language of peace abroad undermine the very global framework they claim to support.
We can combat the menace of terrorism only if there is no distinction between good or bad terrorists, if sanctions regimes function objectively, and if exclusivist frameworks, new terminologies and false priorities are thwarted and set aside. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, terror anywhere threatens peace everywhere. Mr. President.
As terrorism evolves from physical battlefields to digital networks, India's message from the United Nations is clear. The fight against terror cannot succeed if nations continue to draw political distinctions between perpetrators, tolerate proxy networks, or allow financing channels to remain open. For a country that has spent decades confronting cross-border terrorism, the demand is no longer for stronger words, but for consistent global action. Because in the battlefield against terrorism, India says there can be no good terrorist, no bad terrorist, and no room for double standards.
Pakistan's deepening terror crisis is once again under the global spotlight. A deadly attack on a Rangers headquarters in Karachi, followed by Pakistani airstrikes inside Afghanistan, has exposed the worsening security situation in the country. Even as Islamabad attempted to shift blame onto India, New Delhi dismissed the allegations and reminded Pakistan that the real threat lies within its own borders. The latest developments have once again revived the phrase often used for Pakistan's terror policy. The chickens have come home to roost. Here's the report.
Pakistan's long-standing policy of nurturing and tolerating terrorist networks appears to be backfiring once again. Karachi, Pakistan's financial capital, witnessed one of its most significant terrorist attacks in recent years after heavily armed terrorists rammed an explosives-laden vehicle into the Sindh Rangers headquarters in Gulistan-e-Johar before launching a gun assault. The attack left at least 3 Rangers' personnel dead and several others injured. Security forces later killed the attackers during a clearance operation. The assault has been claimed by Jamaat-ul-Ahrar, a faction linked to the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, underlining how Pakistan now finds itself under attack from terrorist groups that emerged from the same ecosystem of jihadist networks it once cultivated for strategic objectives. Recent years have seen a sharp rise in attacks targeting Pakistan's military, police and security installations, particularly after Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan in 2021.
हम बैठे हुए थे घर पे तो चाय वगैरह पी रहे थे तो ज़ोरदार धमाके की आवाज़ आई पहले ना मतलब बिल्कुल हमारे लकड़ी की सीढ़ी है वो भी तकरीबन अपनी जगह से हिल गई है तो मैं बेटे को देखने आ गया अमूमन बच्चे खेल रहे होते हैं तो देखा तो भाई गेट पर ना तो ज़्यादा ही हालात ख़राब थे 8 रेंजेस से फाड़ हो गए तो इतनी शदीद किस्म की फायरिंग स्टार्ट हुई थी इतनी शदीद किस्म की फायरिंग स्टार्ट हुई थी मैं खुद भी डर गया था फिर बच्चा मिला बच्चे को घर लेकर गया फिर वापसी में आए यहाँ पर छुप छुप के देख रहे थे तो तकरीबन 2-3 धमाके अंदर और हुए फिर मौके पर रेंजेस भी पहुँच गई अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह तो अभी सुनने में आया है कि तकरीबन सारे ही जाननुम हासिल हो गए.
The Karachi attack has once again exposed the fragility of Pakistan's internal security. For years, Islamabad projected itself as a victim of terrorism while simultaneously facing international criticism for allowing terror groups to operate from its soil. Analysts have often described the current wave of violence as the chickens coming home to roost, a consequence of decades of using terrorist proxies as instruments of state policy. Unable to contain the deteriorating security environment at home, Pakistan quickly turned its attention across the border. Within hours of the Karachi attack, Pakistani forces launched air and ground operations inside Afghanistan, claiming they had targeted militant hideouts. But Afghan authorities alleged that the strikes hit civilian areas instead, killing dozens of civilians, including women and children. The latest cross-border escalation has further strained already tense relations between Islamabad and the Taliban administration in Kabul.
په کم 12 بجې ټول خلک بیا ولیو مقصد دا تیارې راغلي په دغه پورې حمله شروع کړه په دا کې ماشومان ښځې زنانه سپینګیري ټول خو بیا ولیو.
Residents in eastern Afghanistan described scenes of devastation as homes were reduced to rubble overnight. Afghan officials said dozens were killed and more than 100 injured, disputing Pakistan's claim that only militants were targeted.
د 50 کالر نه وخته ده خوست کې د ولدو چې بمبار وکړو چې دا موږ ته خګر مړ کړل ټول بیګناه خلک ماشومان سپینګیري زنانه دای مړ کړل کونړ کې تاسو خپل ولدو چې یعنی ټول زنانه او سپینګیري وړه ماشومان دای مړ کړل او د مکتب محصلین مړ کړل موږ د کرکټ ځوانان مړ کړل نو پاکستان هنن ورز نه ده چې موږ نه ظلم نه کوي موږ نه زیاتای نه کوي.
Amid mounting criticism, Pakistan attempted to deflect attention by making allegations against India over the Karachi attack. New Delhi categorically rejected those claims. Responding to Islamabad's accusations, Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson Ranveer Jaiswal said Pakistan should stop pointing fingers and instead dismantle the terror infrastructure operating within its own territory. The latest violence serves as another reminder that Pakistan's greatest security challenge today comes not from external adversaries but from the extremist networks that have increasingly turned their guns inward. For a country that spent decades distinguishing between good and bad militants, the Karachi attack is yet another stark illustration that terrorism eventually consumes those who seek to use it.
And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Newsweek South Asia. We'll be back next week with more news, views and analysis from the subcontinent. Meanwhile, do keep writing to us at nwsa@nin.com. This is Shivangi Mishra signing off on behalf of the entire team of Newsweek South Asia. Goodbye and take care.